I got a story to tell you. It's a good one. It's about how these people, the first people, got a voice.
60,000 years they've been speaking.
Had 363 languages.
But no voice. No say on matters which affected them. It wasn't right.
So, me and your granddad.
Me and your mum.
The whole nation did something about it. People called their friends and families. People talked about it on the streets, talked about it at work, on the field. Everybody made a song and dance about it.
Everyone walked side by side.
And that's how we changed this country for the better. How we made history.
Is that story true?
It could be.
Authorised by the Uluru Dialogue Sydney.
Thank you everyone for coming today. We're really lucky to be having this event today on Aboriginal land, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of Wollongong, and also I was a student here, so I had the privilege of studying on this magnificent campus, but also down in Nowra as well. So UOW has campuses across the state, so acknowledging all of mob and traditional owners that the campuses reach out to, and the whole Illawarra Aboriginal community. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm really excited for today's panel. We have some esteemed panellists, some of which used to be my lecturers, which is fun that I get to ask some questions this time around. I've been waiting for this moment. No, but seriously, it's great to have you all here. This year, all Australians will be asked a very important question. So it's really important we open up these dialogues, and it'll be a change to the Constitution, and everyone will be asked whether First Nations people should be recognised as First Peoples through a voice to Parliament, and that's what we hope to unpack today. So thank you for those that are here, that are joining in person, and also we have people joining online as well. And so yes, we do have a Slido that will pop up on the screen, both virtually and now it's up on the screen there. So if you do have any questions that pop up during the talk, please put it through there and we'll get to them at the end. So this session will be sort of covering, although this change obviously impacts Aboriginal communities predominantly, it's a change to the Constitution and it impacts all Australians. So we have a great group of academics here at UOW, non-Indigenous academics that will give us their expertise and opinions on a couple of different topics and across different expertise as well. So my name's Adam. I'm a Barungum Gunguri man from southwest Queensland. I grew up in Canberra on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and now I'm up in Sydney on Gadigal country. And I think just in that shows the diversity of our peoples as well, which hopefully this voice can represent. I'll introduce the panel by letting them introduce themselves. I know, very lazy of me as a panel host, but we'll start from this way. And Belinda, please introduce yourself, how you'd like to be introduced.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. My name is Belinda, and I was born in Wagga Wagga, and I would like to pay respects to the Wiradjuri people, the traditional custodians of the place in which I was born.
Thank you, Belinda.
My name is Niamh Kinchin. I was born in Ireland, and I'd like to acknowledge the Wallamedical people, who are the traditional custodians of the place where I was raised.
My name is Alfredo, and I was born in Manila in the Philippines, and the Negritos were the Aboriginal people in Manila.
Thanks, Adam. My name's Trish. I was born and raised in Mount Druitt in Western Sydney, and I would like to honour and pay my respects to the Darug people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I grew up.
Yeah, and they all are excellent academics as well that talk to it. I had great bios that I won't go through them. You can sort of explore that when we get to the questions as well. So again, the sliders there, get onto it if you have any questions, as I'm sure much you might actually come in with questions as well. So if we don't address it through the panel, we'll be sure to pick it up as well with a password of #UOW. So I think it'll be quite good to just jump in so we can make sure we can address any questions that come through. And we'll start with you, Trish. So Trish, you and a small legal team were engaged by the Vice-Chancellor to investigate the Uluru Statement, the constitutional reform proposal, and how it impacted the university at UOW. Can you just describe that journey that you undertook in order for UOW to solidify our position, meaning the university's position, to support the Uluru Statement from the heart?
Yes, and I think actually as an important first statement is to say that actually that small legal team was brought together at the initiative of the Vice-Chancellor, and I think actually that leadership has actually been really instrumental and important to recognise. So the Vice-Chancellor brought together, I guess, key people that she felt really I guess had a contribution to make, but also I guess could look at some of the obstacles and opportunities for UOW in this move to decide about supporting the statement or not. And I think that team, myself, I think I was Dean of Law at the time. We had Greg Rose, who was our then Chair of Academic Senate. We had Colin Picker, who is the Executive Dean of BAL, and also Meg West, who was the General Counsel of UOW. So by coincidence, we were all lawyers. I'm not sure that was designed that way, but that's how it worked out. And I think that team of people really decided that there was no obstacle really to UOW supporting the statement and the associated constitutional reform. And I think, in fact, what that team, while recognising that, of course, this was political, but as an institution of higher education, that, in fact, the university had a great responsibility and opportunity to actually play a role in education, and as an institute of higher education that actually the statement and the constitutional reform to recognise our First Nations people in fact aligned with the university's values and with our stated championing of equity and social justice. So in fact we saw that it was really critical and connected to who we were as an institution. So in terms of the and I guess also I will just say that it really also went hand in hand with the work that we were doing internally within the university through our Reconciliation Action Plan and some of the ways in which we were embedding First Nations culture within the things that we did within the university. And I can point to our graduation ceremonies as actually one of those really powerful examples. So I guess key to us thinking about next steps in realising our support for the statement and constitutional reform or recognition was the recognition that we needed to walk together, that this was a shared path and that we needed to actually walk beside First Nations people in this space. And as a shared path, that we needed to listen to our First Nations staff and students and actually work out a plan moving forward together. And I think the first thing that we did was have that conversation with Wollongong Indigenous Centre about how we move forward. We then moved through getting formal recognition at the university level, through Academic Senate, through University Council, and the Council and Senate unanimously, well, actually, I can't hand on heart say it was unanimous because I wasn't there, but there was endorsement at both Senate and Council for the university's support for the statement and constitutional reform, and I'm incredibly proud of that. In terms of, after the formal endorsement phase, I think then we went about really creating opportunities for people to learn about what the statement was all about, what the constitutional recognition and the voice was all about. So we had a number of different, forums throughout, the time where people could ask questions and learn about that. And I think what has also been really fantastic is our current online community called Yarn Up, where we've got 300 plus, I think from memory, people, staff and primarily staff, but perhaps students as well, but primarily staff who have joined an online community, and we're actually sharing knowledge and information about, events like this. So it's been incredibly powerful. And I think from my perspective, just a final piece that I will say is that UOW's kind of formal endorsement or support for the constitutional reform really, for me, reflects UOW's commitment on two levels. First, it's a recognition of our responsibility and the opportunity that we have as a higher institution to be able to educate and to play a part in truth-telling more broadly and support that. But as I said, internally, I think really important to the work that we're doing to make sure that we are creating a culturally safe space for our First Nation staff and students.
Yeah, thanks, Tris. It's really good to hear that sort of long story of how UOW came to that position. As a former student, I'm proud to have the institution back something quite formally and as well. And Trish spoke about reconciliation, so I should acknowledge that it is Reconciliation Week, and this event is a part of that. And we do have additional panels that are focusing on the voice as well. So I do encourage, if you're not signed up to them, to go to it. That includes one with Jeff Scott, who's been around Aboriginal affairs for a very long time and is doing a lot of work with Uluru Dialogues. Then we have an all Aboriginal panel as well. So just jump on the website and sign up to them, because UOW does have a really good commitment to reconciliation, and through the leadership of Wollongong Indigenous Centre and Jamie Beveridge, it's been really great to see where the university is going with that all. So, Neve, as a law expert, have you come across any discussions, either for or against, around embedding a voice to Parliament that you feel needs to be debunked? We know this conversation is sort of heating up in the public. There's a lot of different claims going around. From your expertise, is there anything you think needs to...
Yeah, there's a lot going around, but I'd like to focus on two. The first is the inclusion of the words executive government in the provision, in the respect that the voice will be able to make representations to the executive government. First, it's really important that the voice is able to make representations to the executive government, because it's the executive government that formulate the laws and the policy and implement them. So then will this mean that the executive government and the Parliament will be obliged to follow the representations of the voice? The provision doesn't actually say anything about how the voice is to be received. It doesn't create obligations in relation to following what the voice says. It's termed in language of representation. However, that isn't going to particularly prevent the Parliament from creating legislation which says that in some certain contexts, the voice representation should be taken into account. And there's no doubt that the Parliament will do that in certain contextual situations. So what then is the implication for litigation and the High Court? Does that increase the chances of litigation? First of all, in relation to the executive government, you don't just challenge executive policy for a start, executive government's policy. It has to be part of some kind of dispute where there's one or more parties involved. So there has to be a dispute, first of all, and someone has to have standing or has to have the ability to actually take that dispute to the court. But let's say we get past that. Much of what the executive does is what we call non-justiciable, in the sense that it's actually not appropriate for the courts to actually consider it. What the executive government does is often highly political, polycentric, complex cases, say for example, which isn't particularly relevant here, international relations. The court will not consider those things. What the court says is this isn't appropriate for the court, this is appropriate for the executive government. So many of those things will not come before the court. But in some cases they may. What will happen there is the court will ask itself, if the legislative context is appropriate, did the decision maker take the representation of the voice into account? And that means, did the decision maker turn their mind to it? Did they consider it? Did they weigh up the evidence in relation to what the representation was? If the court says the answer is no, what the court then does is send it back to the decision maker and say, remake this decision, taking into account the representation for the voice. The court will not say what the outcome of that decision will be. So we have a very established system that actually prevents a floodgates, which is the argument that comes up. There's no sense that lawyers are going to be walking into courts and slinging the mud at walls and seeing what's going to stick. Lawyers know that they need to have reasoned arguments that based on those things that I'm talking about, or they don't get through the front door of the courthouse. The second issue that I really wanted to talk about was the contention that it creates a racialised constitution and confers racial advantage to one group over others. My first point of that this is not about race, that giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders a voice in Parliament is about recognising that they are the first peoples of this nation, and that accords with the United Nations principles and recommendations to work towards self-determination for Indigenous people. The second thing is calls that this may cause a racialised constitution are completely disingenuous when race is already in the constitution. There is something called the race power, which gives the Parliament the ability to make laws, special laws that are necessary in regards to race already. There is also another section in the constitution that's around race, which is it's largely redundant, but it exists in there. So then the question is does this confer disadvantage on non-Indigenous people? And the answer is simply no. It takes away no rights of non-Indigenous people and it confers no new obligations. And then the final question has to be, does this confer advantage on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? The reality is this is about equity of participation in legal processes. And that is not just formal equity. It has to also be about recognising where there has been marginalised voices and raising those marginalised voices up. And the High Court recognises that as well. Oh, sorry, I've just lost my train of thought now. I knew that I would do that. Just a moment, sorry. So of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' voices have been completely marginalised. Prior to 1967, they were actively excluded from parts of the Constitution. Despite all the best intentions of the 1967 referendum, the race power still exists in a way that there is an ability to create detrimental laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples because the High Court has left that wide open. And there's no positive recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And, you know, if we had had the voice in 2007, then Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would have at least had a say in the NT interventions. So this is not about conferring advantage, it is remedying disadvantage.
Thanks, Trish. And with Reconciliation Week, that did start off with marking the 1967 referendum, and there has been conversations about how this may pull that back, and I think you addressed it quite clearly, that in fact that referendum simply entrenched that power, really, just transferred it to the federal parliament. So yeah, and it's only ever been used for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well. Yes. So that's how it's been used in the past. We'll now go to Alfredo, former lecturer. So I'll be...
Make me proud.
I'll be sending you marks later. Do you see any economic impact for society with this change?
Right, so I guess I should first preface the answer by saying that I am coming from a country that was occupied by foreign nations as well. First the Spanish, then the British, then the Spanish again, then the Americans, then the Japanese, then the Americans again. So I do share the generational trauma and what the Uluru Statement from the Heart calls the torment of powerlessness that has brought forth this call for recognition by Indigenous Australians. And I think the voice to Parliament represents a significant, crucial step towards empowering the Indigenous Australians so that they can control their economic lives. But to be honest, it's difficult to provide any evidence on the economic impact of the voice to Parliament. I'm not aware of any studies that have been performed ex ante. And studying it ex post is also a difficult undertaking, right? Because of something that statisticians and economists call the fundamental problem of causal inference, right? You would need to observe two versions of Australia, one with a voice and one without the voice, and track economic indicators over time. But of course, there's only one version of Australia at any given time, right? So it's a difficult undertaking to evaluate it ex post, right? However, right, there are other areas of economics that we can draw lessons from, right? So economics is very broad. We look at, for example, political economy. We look at new institutional economics, which really examines how institutions are organized in society and how they can deliver on economic impacts. And from that literature, we can draw some lessons, right? So one lesson is looking at the abolition of apartheid in South Africa. Economists like looking at utility. Of course, utility is very difficult to measure, so we ask questions instead that pertain to life satisfaction. So you would be asked a question on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your life in general? With 5 being the most satisfied, 1 being the least satisfied. So we do observe an increase in life satisfaction at the end of apartheid in South Africa. But the question that economists would ask is that because of better outcomes that underrepresented minorities in South Africa experienced, or is it because of increased representation in how they determine their lives? Well, as it turns out, it's both, right? Of course, people are much happier if they are better off in society, but also they were much happier because they were able to participate in things that determine aspects of their lives, what economists call procedural utility. So utility not just derived because you are richer, but because you were able to participate in making the decisions that made you richer, right? Of course, dictatorships and democratic governments can, in principle, achieve the same outcomes, right? In principle. But as it turns out, things that are achieved through democratic means are valued much more by people than those that are dictated upon, right? Another thing that kind of like addresses the problem of causal inference head on is to run, of course, a randomized control trial, which political economists have done, and they look at particularly separating the mechanism of vote versus the voice. And I will, paraphrasing their study, the crucial factor that determines the efficiency of the organization is not so much whether people can vote, but rather whether they were consulted, or the voice, right? So all this to say that it's a difficult question to answer when we're seeking evidence for the economic impact of the voice, right? But I think that question misses the point entirely, actually, because the strongest argument for the voice is not utilitarian, it's not consequentialist, it's not whether it can deliver the best economic outcomes. I think the strongest case for the voice is that it is a recognition of the special status of First Nations people in Australia, and a recognition of the historical and contemporaneous injustices that they are experiencing. So I think through the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Indigenous voice to Parliament, Indigenous Australians really are calling for a new era of economic opportunity and equality that benefits all Australians. And I think we should listen.
Yeah. HD, that was really good.
Thank you.
There was a bit there, I'm like feeling like my lectures, but we got back.
Thank you. I'll take my HD.
I'm like, correlation, not causation. I was back there. But you know, it's really useful to know, and because there is a lot of misinformation out there, and this happens with Aboriginal affairs, when any change is proposed, suddenly it becomes back to sort of what happened around native title of Aboriginal people will be able to kick people out of their homes and that sort of thing. So I think also, I know that's not really an economic question, don't challenge me, but I think it's good to point out that it's not really an economic change. It can influence the changes, particularly in the institutions of Australia, because it does that by definition. Thanks for sharing that. We'll get Belinda on now. I know Belinda as well. We did some work together, actually, so I did get around UOW a bit. But you're an expert on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so I'm really interested, what will the referendum and the constitutional reform, how will that support or advance any of those, that sort of infrastructure or any of those goals?
Thanks, Adam. I would just firstly like to acknowledge that the beautiful land on which I'm very grateful to be on today is Aboriginal land, and pay respects to Aboriginal colleagues that are in the room and online. I guess, not sure how we define expert, but I'll give it a red hot crack. As you know, many of you know in this room, the SDGs are all about improving people's lives whilst protecting our natural resources. And they do this, the framework does this, it cuts through divisions of development, politics, economics, it cuts through sectors, it cuts through religions, and it cuts through race. And it asks us to come together and collaborate and partner to work together on some of the most significant challenges that our generation will face. The UN acknowledges that we will not truly achieve sustainable development without protecting our traditional knowledge systems. And so the referendum and constitutional reform is all about protecting our First Nations people's knowledge systems. I guess if we think about, the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, Sustainable Development Goal 4, quality education, we are already advancing and supporting that Sustainable Development Goal by being here today. We are having a conversation and we are all learning more. So yes, the reform and constitution will advance and support the Sustainable Development Goals. From a quality education perspective, our First Nations people being able to have a voice, for us to be able to listen, hear that voice, and take that advice, hear their stories, their songs, will enable us to learn more about our environment and learn more about our nation's history. So SDG 4 is a big one. I wonder what SDG came to your mind when you guys listened to this question. Have we got any? Carly, give me one. Probably, I would say 13 is probably climate action, is the one that actually comes to mind first. It's the one that we're all thinking about at the moment. So our First Nations people have ancient knowledge, through generations of sustained communities that have lived on our country for thousands and thousands of years. And those generations have so much knowledge about the relationships that humans have with the environment. And we need to hear that, and we need to listen to it, and we need to take that advice. So the voice will strengthen our capacity, our adaptive capacity to climate related hazards and natural disasters. SDG 15, life on land. Our First Nations people are our de facto guardians of biodiversity. We live in a country that has thousands of unique species of animals and plants. And we need to listen to those things that are going extinct and that are under threat. So we need to listen, and the voice will ensure that their advice is heard so that we can conserve resource and sustain, I guess, as we move forward and live on and want to live, on this country. SDG 6, clean water. I could go on forever, but I'm only going to do a couple. So 6, water is our most precious resource. If we don't have it, there is nothing. First Nations peoples for thousands and thousands of years had known how to sustainably use water. Okay, so these are some of the topics that are coming up. SDG 2, zero hunger. Getting the balance right between what we eat, our food, the ecosystems, what we grow, how we grow. And of course SDG 17, which is partnerships. That's a big one. How we work together and how we come together, because this planet is at risk, and we are facing many slowly creeping crises that we see a little bit, but underlyingly they are forever growing. So I feel that it is our responsibility to give our Indigenous people a voice, and ultimately will be for the well-being of our planet. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's also good to always sort of ground the conversation around the voice, around the process that has led us to this moment as well. It's not something new. It's been, well, even in the constitutional sense, it's been at least a decade of different processes, including the dialogues that led to the statement. And although there is diversity in views in Aboriginal communities as well, it is one of the longest processes that have occurred. So it is a proposition that's been put forth by Aboriginal people too, and that plays, I think, an important factor. This next question is going across all 4 of our guests. And it's a pretty simple one, but an interesting one. So I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives on it. You can either take that from your academic perspective, or add in your own personal views outside of that. Doesn't have to be a scientific experiment. You don't need the paper, Alfredo. Sorry, I'm enjoying this too much. So we'll start with Trish and then move along. But the question is, if the yes vote is successful and the constitutional change comes about, how will it impact non-Indigenous Australian people?
Thank you. I'm being optimistic, and I'm not saying if, I'm saying when, because I truly believe actually that it will happen. How will it impact non-Indigenous people? Look, I actually think it will impact it significantly. Of course, this is about giving a voice to Indigenous people through the constitutional reform process. But I think really in order for us to achieve reconciliation or meaningful reconciliation in this country, we actually we need to do that from a place of respect and from a place of mutual respect and walking together. And to me, what the voice does is it is a platform to acknowledge all of the past injustices. It's a platform for truth-telling, and to me that is a necessary critical step in order to achieve reconciliation, and we will all benefit from reconciliation. But it can't happen until I believe, and certainly what I feel like I hear is the truth-telling and the platform to really for First Nations people to really put forward what it is that they need and to have us listen.
Alfredo.
Now I'm going to be struggling. No, well, so I am an economist, right? And one of if anyone has taken Econ 100, the first lesson in economics is resources are scarce. And I linked that to kind of what I was saying earlier, in that having a voice, we have a very long and wide literature that looks at inclusive governance and stakeholder engagement and how it impacts on organizational efficiency. Having a voice, I think, will make governments much more efficient, right? And to the extent that efficiency means savings, that will allow many more resources to be spent on things that we think are important, right? So even for things that are matters completely within the purview of non-Indigenous Australians, to the extent that the Australian government can save resources, that will matter to them. It is not something that you can sort of overestimate, that importance, especially now that everyone here is acutely aware of the problems of cost of living, people struggling to pay rent, people struggling to find housing, and a much more efficient government that decides where to spend money most productively will benefit not just the Indigenous Australians, but also the non-Indigenous Australians. So all Australians really will benefit from that. And that comes from primarily having the consultative process that the voice will enshrine in the Constitution. So that's a very crucial point, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you're sort of speaking to relates to what's really laid out in the rights to Indigenous people through the United Nations, that of self-determination and being able to have consulted on anything that impacts them, and that's really what the voice is about. Neve.
I mean, I think from a law perspective and a constitutional law perspective, I spoke to this anyway because I think it doesn't impact any obligations or take away any rights of non-Indigenous people. It introduces some legal principles that are part of our normal legal system that would just need to be taken into account. But that's the way it works. That happens all the time. So I don't see that. But I think more broadly, I think for those of us that support the voice and support social justice, it allows us, or perhaps it firms maybe, or steps towards the Australians that we want to be and that we see ourselves as, and we are able to maybe stand a little taller in the international space when we look at ourselves in the mirror, because I think for many of us, and I can say this, sometimes I feel so out of touch with what the government is doing, certainly in the last few years, and it doesn't seem to represent me. So I think we can just be a little bit prouder of who we are and maybe affirm with our own values. So yeah, I just think that would be a really positive thing for us as our national identity.
I guess for me, just a bit of an analogy. Do you remember when, during COVID and, we'd turn on the TV every morning and,
I try not to remember.
I know. Whatever PM was, in government at the time, and he would stand next to the chief financial officer, and we would also have the hearing aid person standing next to them. And I remember, we would watch that, and, probably for the first time in my generation, would you have a prime minister standing next to a chief medical officer and listening to the chief medical officer and taking advice because he didn't have the answers. And I think for me, I see it, I know it's very different, but I do see it in that light, in that our at that federal government level, they are making decisions without the information that they need. And so I see it like that, whether it's on the TV like that, it should be, but that's how I see the conversation happening, and that's what, for me as a non-Indigenous person, that's what I want to see. I want to see them listening, because our country is in some serious, serious problems, and we need to listen to people who've been there here a lot longer than us. So that's how I see it impacting us.
Yeah, and I think, again, to go back to the Uluru statement, it was that invitation to all Australians. So it really has always been about inviting Australians to walk with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because we recognise that's the way we've got to move forward. And this is one step in a long process. So a reminder, there is the Slido up there. We've come to the conclusion of my questions. So we've already got a few coming in, but please add on to the questions, and we do still have a bit of time to get to quite a few. So we'll start from the first question that we got through, and I'll just read it out. The statement from the heart calls for the voice and makarata, which is truth-telling and treaty. It's a Yolngu word. The no case is already littered with historical inaccuracies. What role does the panel think the University of Wollongong can play or should play in truth-telling? Great question, Dave, I think that was really good. So I'll open up to everyone. Each of you can give an answer, but who wants to go first? Or I'll pick someone, because I got the power.
I'm happy to say a few words, and I guess I'm speaking, the answer I'm providing is perhaps from the context of when I was Dean of Law. So the law school has, I guess long supported the statement, and certainly we made submissions. I can't recall if I mentioned this, but the law school had made a submission in support of the statement and calling on the government to prioritise consultation with First Nations people around what the voice would look like. So for me, it is really critical that the university does play a part in this space, and I think it is very well placed to do so. And certainly from the perspective of the law school, we see this opportunity through our curriculum. So at the moment, the law school is really doing an audit of its curriculum, looking at where opportunities are to embed in the curriculum this truth-telling, in a sense, at all levels. So for me, it's critical, and there are so many opportunities, and I'm really proud of what the university, UOW, has been doing over the last few years in this space, taking those steps. A long way to go, but I feel like we have really prioritised partnerships, walking together and working together, and we are taking those baby steps, and there's a lot more to be done, but a critical role.
Does anyone else have anything I want to add to that? It was a good answer. HD. No. I'm just seeing how long that joke can run for. So we've got another good question, and I'm sure many of the audience would have seen this come up either through the news or different panels. Will constitutional recognition of First Nations people compromise sovereignty? And I guess in that sense, they're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty.
I might take this one. First of all, this is a really complicated question. It seems to be simple, but it's absolutely not. Part of the reason is because the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty is actually, there are different ways of looking at it across communities. But essentially, so if we start with the fact that obviously Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders sovereignty is about the connection obviously to custom and land and country, and that it has always been here. So sort of false flags like terra nullius and those principles, we know we disregard those. It's never stopped. There is a thinking that sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people exists alongside the Constitution, and what needs to happen. So that it was never gone, and it has always continued alongside. And so what then needs to happen is just better ways to recognise that sovereignty, so through laws, through practice. So if we take that perspective, then that's exactly what the voice is doing. It's further recognising Indigenous sovereignty. But I have to acknowledge that there's a different type of sovereignty, and the Western type of sovereignty, where it's about power and autonomy in an international law space. And there are some discussions around Indigenous sovereignty that is more along those lines. So that is where we see discussions around treaty, and that's something that I don't want to particularly talk about, except to say that bringing the voice into the Constitution in no way prevents a treaty. So this is not, those two things don't particularly talk to each other. The treaty is something that the executive government will decide upon and will enter into, and what that looks like, it's a separate thing. So whether that happens or not, the voice is not going to impact that. So it is a little complicated because I said that it's the complicated view of what sovereignty, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty is, but I don't see the voice in either perspective taking away from it.
Thank you. That's great. And I think that was great through the parliamentary process. A lot of the legal experts have really explored what you just spoke to in really clear ways. So if anyone has time and is a nerd, you can go back and watch them as well. We got another question. Thanks for sending the questions through. That's how you say liberal, apparently. The Liberal Party have taken a no position on the voice. Is this purely political, given that there's been so many benefits to representation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And I'll open it up, it's a big one. No?
I never imagined myself in the position of Peter Dutton. So.
Yeah,
Well, I think it is, yes. I mean, I think that's the clear answer because I don't see why why they are against the yes. Basically, there's no because of the reasons that we've discussed, because of the constitutional reasons, those sorts of things that I was trying to debunk are easily debunked. The voice is actually a very conservative constitutional change, and they know that. But the way that politics has evolved in recent years is that parties are very responsive to their electorates and the people. We seen the rise of populism. I'm not particularly saying it goes this far, but I cannot see that it's just that it isn't political, that they are responding to what they believe their base wants, essentially.
Yeah.
And sorry, I just also the point to say that to not support the voice is also political. I mean, yeah, both of those things are true, and I think Neve's point is a good one.
Not from a legal perspective whatsoever. I just think it's interesting, from a non-legal perspective, to watch this play out, in our homes with our children, and to watch, the Liberal Party bring Aboriginal people into this discussion to have the counter argument. And so I think it's important that non-Indigenous people, don't speak on behalf of Aboriginal people. We're not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and so I feel, it's really important that even he's speaking about it. To be honest, and he's speaking very loud, and so I think that's interesting too. That the respect, that we're playing there.
Yeah, and I think it's always good to remember it's a referendum. So each of us, if we're enrolled to vote, we'll have our moment in that ballot box, and it's ultimately up to us and not what happens in Parliament. So another one we got here is, what do you suggest, and you've sort of spoken to this a bit in your answers already, but I'll ask it a bit more explicitly. What do you suggest non-Indigenous people need to do now until the vote in relation to educating and supporting the yes vote? And I want to pick on Alfredo.
Staring at me. I think it's incumbent, because it is a referendum, right? There is a shared responsibility to educate each other on the issue. And I did mention at the start, I come from the Philippines, right? So I went to the University of the Philippines. It's a very kind of left-of-center university, a home for scholar activists. And in 1972, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, right? And this is not a dictatorship that we have here in Australia, but I guess sometimes it might feel that way to those that are dispossessed. And the campus newspaper, the Philippine Collegian, had this front page story in 1976, 4 years after the declaration of martial law. And the question that was asked by the then editor-in-chief, Abraham Sarmiento, was, and I'll speak in Tagalog, kung hindi tayo kikibo, sinong kikibo? Kung hindi tayo kikilos, sinong kikilos? Kung hindi ngayon, kailan? Which in English is, if we do not speak up, who will speak up, right? If we do not act, who will act? And if not now, when? I think it's important for people leaving this room today to ask yourselves that question, right? Who will do it, right? If not all of us, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to ask the question and to advocate for what I feel is so patently obvious a social justice issue, right? That's my take on it.
Thanks.
Can I add to that? I think we also have to consider what not to do. Don't get angry at different opinions. Don't, listen. Well, I guess when you're having those conversations, you'll all have them with different people in your lives, in different forums. But it can sometimes be frustrating when people have very different opinions to you that may go against some of your core values. But it's also really important not to react angrily and basically extinguish that conversation very quickly. Listen respectfully, and then perhaps then present a rational and clear argument back. But just think about the way that those arguments run, and if you need to step back, do before you can re-engage.
And I would like to add that I feel as a non-Indigenous person, and non-Indigenous people generally have the lion's share of actually doing the work here. And I guess speaking as a queer woman who experienced the marriage equality debate, in fact I was talking about that a little earlier, this is that on steroids, because we're talking about, a referendum, a constitutional change that will actually be much harder to achieve than a postal vote. And I know the experience for me and my community during that time, and I can't even imagine what that is. And I was so grateful to my allies, to my family and friends who actually actively stood up and spoke and in support of marriage equality, as it's just a no-brainer, that this was just a social justice and an equality issue that really needed to happen. So I really just want to say that we as non-Indigenous people have the full responsibility to get this over the line, and I just see it as such an opportunity, a collective opportunity for us all to not only do the right thing, but actually to do is exactly as Neve said, which is actually allow us to stand taller and to get this done.
Yeah, thanks. And as a former student here, it's really powerful to hear you all speak. And I know if there's an Aboriginal student watching this, it means something to them to hear staff speaking about this in impassioned ways. I know you'd hate me saying you spoke impassionately, Alfredo. We have one more question, and I promise I won't bug Alfredo again. So given Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have significantly worse health outcomes, can you see the changes in the Constitution as an actual way forward to rectify the inequality in health?
I definitely do. Good health and well-being in this country is actually, from a sustainable development goal perspective, they love their dashboards. And whilst we think as a country, we have a healthy society, we don't, and we don't have good health systems, and especially for our First Nations and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And we need to listen to their voice to understand, what they need in that regard. Alternate medicines, alternate resources, alternate ways. We need to understand that and start to infiltrate that and those knowledge systems through our systems.
Thank you. So that brings us to an end to the panel. I want to thank all four of you for coming today. I'm sure you're very busy. That wasn't sarcastic. But yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really great to have this open dialogue in universities and to invite everyone through. So thank you very much for your time. And I also want to thank Wollongong Indigenous Centre and Jamie Beveridge in particular. She's done amazing work in the years that she's been here and had impacted me as a student. I'm sure everyone in the university is noticing change at UOW. So thank you very much. And yes, if you haven't signed up to the other talks, please do. It's really important to hear Aboriginal perspectives as well. So thank you very much.